Okay, let's kick things off with a pretty startling number. For years now, the American National Election Studies have found something consistent. Around 65% of Americans, agree that the government is run by just a few big interests looking out for themselves, not for the benefit of everyone.
That's a huge number.
It really is. And it flags this potential disconnect, right, between the democratic ideal we all sort of learn about and what so many people seem to actually feel or experience.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because for this deep dive, we're diving deep into the sources you provided, and we're going to focus particularly on this book, Democracy for Realists: Why Elections Do Not Produce Responsible Government.
Mm-hmm.
Our mission really is to try and understand that gap, the gap between the sort of textbook idea, the folk theory of democracy.
Right, where informed citizens make policy choices at the ballot box.
Exactly. And the often messy and surprising reality of how democratic politics actually seems to work.
And what's really compelling about this book, by Achen and Bartels, is that they don't just take those democratic ideals for granted. They take a really hard look at them. Mm. They've based it on, decades of analyzing American political history, tons of public opinion data. Mm. They're really trying to test the ideals, not just affirm them.
Exactly. So think of this as maybe your fast track to a more clear-eyed view of elections and, what impact they actually have.
Moving beyond the simple story.
Yeah, beyond that simple story of popular control. We're hoping for some genuine aha moments as we unpack some frankly unexpected findings from their research.
We won't get totally lost in the weeds, hopefully.
No. The goal is to pull out the really key insights. How do elections actually function? What really drives political behavior? And what shapes policy outcomes?
Okay. So the book really starts by tackling head-on what they call the folk theory of democracy. This is, like you said, that common idea that elections are mainly driven by citizens voting based on their policy preferences. And then the assumption is elected officials sort of dutifully carry out the will of the people.
Right. And they bring up Robert Dahl's work pretty early on. Dahl laid out these ideal conditions for a democratic process, things like effective participation, voting equality, enlightened understanding, control of the agenda, including all adults, the basics. And the folk theory kind of just assumes that if you have these structures in place, you'll get political equality when it comes to deciding policy.
But that's the big assumption they start to question.
You were there.
And one of the first places they look is, well, how much do voters actually know about policy? And how consistently do they even think about it?
That's a big one.
They dig into the classic work of Philip Converse from way back. He found, pretty strikingly, that a lot of voters just don't have these stable, coherent ideological frameworks we might imagine.
Like a neat left-right scale in their head.
Exactly. Instead, people often think about politics more in terms of which groups they belong to, or just a general sense of, are times good or bad?
Yeah.
Converse famously argued that for many, their political ideas had, quote, no shred of policy significance whatever.
Wow. So not really organized thinking, more like gut feelings or group ties.
Sort of. He found that people's identification with a party, their partisanship, was actually much more stable over time than their specific opinions on policies.
So loyalty to Team Red or Team Blue was stronger than commitment to a specific play in the playbook.
That's a good way to put it. And look, Converse's work definitely sparked a lot of debate over the years, but there's a pretty broad consensus now among political scientists that the average citizen's political thinking isn't nearly as detailed or ideologically sophisticated as that folk theory kind of requires.
It goes beyond just ideology, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Later researchers, like Deli Carpini and Keeter, they showed that this confusion about ideology is really just, as they put it, the tip of a large iceberg of widespread political unawareness. Basic facts, who holds what office, what government is doing, there are big gaps.
So that picture of the voter as this, super informed policy analyst making careful choices, but the evidence just doesn't really back that up for a lot of people.
Not for the majority, it seems.
Okay, but then there's the other argument. Even if voters aren't policy experts, maybe they can still control politicians by looking back, right? Evaluating their performance.
The retrospective voting idea.
Yeah, reward the good guys, punish the bad guys. Giving a restaurant a bad review if the service was terrible last time, even if you don't remember the waiter's name.
It's definitely a theory that's gained a lot of traction. It sounds plausible. It feels like something we do.
But I sense a but coming.
Well, as the book explores, even this seemingly simpler way for voters to exert control, it runs into some pretty significant problems, too.
Okay, let's talk about mandates. After an election, you always hear politicians claim, the people have spoken. They want us to do X. How solid is that claim, really?
Well, the book argues it's often pretty shaky. The core problem is just how difficult it is to translate messy election results into some kind of clear, specific policy instruction.
Because people vote for all sorts of reasons.
Exactly. In our really complex political world with so many different issues, Achen and Bartels argue that a single policy that a true majority of voters actually agrees on, well, it might not even exist. People vote based on the candidate, the party, maybe one or two issues they care about, maybe just habit. It's a whole mix. It's rarely just about finding the perfect policy alignment.
It's like picking a movie bundle. You want one film, but you get a whole package deal.
That's a great analogy. And they even touch on these things called chaos theorems from social choice theory. It's complicated stuff, but the gist is that the conditions you need for a large group's preferences to add up to a stable, coherent will of the people, those conditions are surprisingly fragile and often don't hold in the real world.
So trying to find the majority preference on lots of issues at once is mathematically tricky.
Very tricky. Now, sure, political arguments and campaigns try to simplify things, maybe reduce the number of dimensions people are thinking about.
Focus on the economy or healthcare.
Right. But that fundamental challenge of aggregating all those diverse, complex individual views into one clear mandate, it's still a huge hurdle.
And what about the idea that parties are forced to the center to win votes? Does the evidence support that?
Well, the book presents evidence that sort of pushes back against that simple median voter theorem idea. They point to research showing that actual policy outcomes tend to shift quite substantially depending on which party controls the government.
So who wins matters for policy?
It definitely seems to. But interestingly, the overall policy mood of the public, like the general public's leaning on issues, seems to have a much smaller, more modest effect on those policy shifts compared to just which party is in charge.
That definitely resonates with what you often see, doesn't it? Like the intense partisan polarization in Congress. Representatives often seem to vote straight down the party line.
Even if it seems out of step with maybe what their specific constituents back home want on a particular issue.
Yeah. The book notes there's maybe a modest, positive relationship within each party between constituent views and how their rep votes.
But the big story is the massive divide between the parties. That partisan gap seems to swamp a lot of other factors.
So if you're hoping that just tweaking the rules of elections, changing how we draw districts or how we vote, is going to magically ensure popular control of policy.
The book suggests the evidence for that is pretty limited. It's likely more complicated than just changing the rules.
Okay, this next part really made me think this idea that maybe more democracy, like direct democracy through initiatives and referendums, isn't always the answer either.
Right. This goes back to the progressive era, where there was this strong belief that giving citizens a direct say would empower the people, bypass corrupt politicians. You know the story.
Give power back to the people.
But Achen and Bartels make a case and cite others like David Broder, arguing that these direct democracy processes have often, maybe unintentionally, been captured or heavily influenced by well-funded interest groups.
So instead of empowering average citizens, it sometimes empowers groups with money to push their own policy goals.
That's the argument. Money can fund signature gathering, run advertising campaigns. It can still play a huge role, even when voters have the final say.
And they give some examples where this seems to have backfired, right?
Yeah, some really striking ones. They mentioned voters in Illinois using a referendum to cut local fire district budgets.
Lower taxes. Sounds good on the surface.
Sure, but the potential downside, degraded fire protection, maybe slower response times, potentially even higher insurance rates down the line. So the question is, were voters really making a choice that served their own long-term best interests?
It highlights the potential for, well, unintended consequences when complex issues are put to a simple yes-no vote.
Absolutely. And it brings up the issue of information. They discuss the fluoridation debates back in the 50s and 60s.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about those.
Voters in many communities rejected adding fluoride to water, often based on, frankly, misinformation, fear-mongering, confusion.
Even though the scientific consensus was pretty clear on the health benefits.
Right. So voters with direct control made a choice that arguably harmed their own health and their children's health. The book calls these kinds of things self-defeating choices.
It's pretty sobering thought that direct control doesn't automatically equal good outcomes, especially if voters are confused or misled.
And to understand why we often default to thinking more democracy is the fix, the book takes a quick look back at how the idea of popular sovereignty grew in America.
Because it wasn't always the dominant idea, was it?
Not at all. In the early days, many of the founders were actually pretty skeptical of direct mass democracy. They worried about mob rule, instability, uninformed decisions.
But then things shifted.
Yeah, you see a real shift, especially around the time of Andrew Jackson and thinkers like Tocqueville observing American democracy. The idea that ultimate political authority, sovereignty resides with the people really took root.
And the expansion of suffrage, who could actually vote, obviously played a huge part in that.
Definitely. And this belief in popular sovereignty led to reforms trying to give voters more direct power. But again, unintended consequences pop up.
Like the direct primary.
Exactly. The goal was noble. Take candidate selection away from smoke-filled rooms and party bosses, give it to the voters.
She's democratic.
But the argument Achen and Bartels present is that it might have weakened the ability of party organizations to sort of manage politics effectively, maybe leading to more instability or candidates who are harder to hold accountable.
They mentioned the McGovern-Fraser Commission reforms after 1968 too, right?
Yeah.
Opening up the presidential nomination process.
Yeah, making more inclusive, driven by primaries and caucuses. But there's this paradox they point out. Sometimes parties that are more open and inclusive in their nomination processes might end up being slightly less representative of the average party voter than systems where party elites have a bit more control. It's counterintuitive.
And even with things like term limits, often passed by initiative, has that filled legislatures with everyday citizen politicians?
Not necessarily. The book notes that often experienced politicians just find ways to navigate the system, maybe moving between different offices. It hasn't always led to the radical change proponents hoped for.
And they bring up Proposition 103 in California, the auto insurance rollback.
Another example of something that sounded appealing to voters, lower insurance rates, but proved incredibly complex and difficult to implement effectively in the real world, leading to lots of legal battles and arguments about whether it actually worked as intended.
Let's circle back to that Illinois fire district example for a second. There was more research on that.
Yes, Tesson's study. It found that districts requiring voter referendums for tax increases did tend to have slower growth in revenue. And crucially, this potentially correlated with longer emergency response times.
So the trade-off wasn't necessarily clear to voters?
Maybe not. And they connect this to the devastating Piedmont fire in California. Piedmont was an area that had strongly supported Proposition 13, which drastically cut property taxes funding local services. They suffered immense losses in that fire, and investigations pointed to the impact of those service cuts. It's a tragic illustration of how voters, perhaps not fully grasping the trade-offs, can make choices that leave them vulnerable.
Wow. Okay, so direct democracy isn't a simple fix. Let's shift gears then to this idea of retrospective voting again, but specifically blind retrospection.
Right. This is the idea. Voters look back at how things went under the current incumbent or party.
Economy good, keep them. Economy bad, throw them out.
Basically, yes, but without necessarily digging into why things were good or bad or whether the politicians actually deserved credit or blame.
And they mentioned Donald Stokes' point here that just throwing the rascals out is fundamentally different from making a conscious choice between policy alternatives.
Exactly. Stokes emphasized valence issues, things everyone wants, like peace and prosperity. It's easy to judge based on those outcomes, but it doesn't mean you're engaging with policy specifics.
The problem, though, is figuring out how much the government is actually responsible.
That's a huge challenge for voters. There's so much uncertainty. Was the economic boom because of the president's policies or just global trends? Was the recession their fault or inevitable? The book includes a figure 4.1, showing how this uncertainty complicates things for incumbents.
And media coverage can skew perceptions, too.
Definitely. The book brings up the example of George H.W. Bush's defeat in '92. The economy was actually recovering, but media coverage might have focused more on lingering anxieties, potentially shaping voters' retrospective judgments negatively. Our perception of performance matters, maybe even more than the objective reality sometimes.
And here's a key point. The book argues there isn't strong evidence that past performance is actually a good predictor of future performance anyway.
Right. So even if voters could accurately judge the past, basing their vote solely on that might not lead to better government in the future. The skills needed to clean up a mess might be different from those needed to build something new.
And this retrospective pressure can lead politicians to pander, right?
Yes, that's the term they use. Incumbents might feel pressured to enact policies that are popular in the short term, maybe boosting approval ratings before an election, even if those policies are unwise or unsustainable in the long run.
Just to look like they're doing something.
Pretty much. And term length seems to play a role here. Remember the fluoridation example?
Yeah.
Officials with longer terms seemed a bit more insulated from the immediate public pressure and misinformation, perhaps allowing them to make decisions based more on evidence than on short-term popularity swings.
Okay, now for the really wild examples of blind retrospection. The oil prices one.
Oh yeah, Wolfer's study. It found that governors in oil-producing states got a boost in votes when oil prices went up and got punished when they went down.
Even though the governor has virtually no control over global oil prices.
Exactly. It strongly suggests voters were rewarding or punishing based purely on the outcome, the economic condition tied to oil, not on any assessment of the governor's actual competence or actions, just times are good bad here, must be your fault doing.
And then, the sharks.
The 1916 New Jersey shark attacks. It's almost comical if it weren't reflecting something serious about voting.
What did they find?
Researchers found a statistically significant drop in votes for the incumbent president, Woodrow Wilson, specifically in the New Jersey coastal counties affected by the attacks.
Because voters blamed Wilson for shark attacks.
It seems absurd, but the data suggests voters punished the incumbent for this completely random, uncontrollable, terrifying event happening on his watch. It's a stark example of blind reaction.
Wow. And they extend this kind of analysis to weather.
Yes, droughts and floods. They analyzed presidential election results across the 20th century and found a consistent pattern.
What was it?
Voters tend to punish the incumbent party at the ballot box in states that experience severe droughts or abnormally wet conditions in the election year.
Regardless of whether the incumbent was a Democrat or Republican.
Apparently, yes. It didn't seem to matter what the party's policies or ideology were regarding agriculture or disaster relief. If voters suffered hardship because of extreme weather, they tended to vote against the party in power.
Just a simple, things were bad, get rid of them, reaction.
It really points towards that kind of simple, almost reflexive, throw the rascals out mentality driven by personal hardship, whether or not the rascals had anything to do with it.
But then, how do they explain something like the 1918-19 influenza pandemic? That was devastating. Far worse than shark attacks or a bad harvest year. Did that affect elections?
Interestingly, the book argues it had very little discernible electoral impact.
Why the difference? That seems counterintuitive.
The author suggests the key difference might be the narrative. With the shark attacks or the droughts, even if irrational, it was perhaps easier for voters to vaguely connect the bad event to the incumbent. This bad thing happened while they were in charge. But with the pandemic, which was so widespread and maybe less understood, perhaps no convincing story emerged that clearly blamed the government for its occurrence or spread, at least not in a way that swayed votes significantly. The narrative of responsibility wasn't there.
So it's not just the event, but whether there's a story linking it, however loosely, to the people in power.
That seems to be the crucial factor. It really underscores how difficult it is for voters, who often have, let's be honest, a pretty vague understanding of the complex links between government actions and their own well-being, to engage in truly accurate, informed, retrospective voting.
Okay, so if policy preferences are weak guides and retrospective voting is often blind, what's left? What is driving votes?
Well, this brings us to the final major theme of the book. The overwhelming importance of group and party loyalties.
Ah, back to the teams.
Pretty much. The argument is that these loyalties are often the primary drivers of vote choice, frequently overshadowing specific policy considerations or even retrospective judgments.
So people aren't picking a party because it perfectly matches their policy views, but more like choosing a social identity.
In many cases, yes. Citizens often align with a party because it represents a coalition of social groups they feel they belong to based on race, religion, class, culture, region, you name it. It's about feeling like these are my people.
And what happens when those identities conflict with policy views? Like the classic example of a pro-choice Republican or a pro-life Democrat.
The book discusses how people navigate these cross pressures. Sometimes they prioritize one identity over another, and sometimes, remarkably, individuals will actually change their policy views over time to align better with their chosen party identity rather than change parties.
So the party shapes the view, not the other way around.
It can certainly work that way, yes. The party becomes the anchor.
And this partisan loyalty, it doesn't just shape opinions, does it? It can affect how people see reality.
That's one of the most striking findings they discuss. Partisan loyalty can actually shape perceptions of factual information.
Oh,
They use the example of perceptions of the federal budget deficit under President Clinton. The deficit was shrinking, eventually becoming a surplus, but polls showed that many Republicans, even those who were generally well-informed about politics, continued to believe the deficit was increasing. Their factual belief aligned with their party's narrative, not the objective data.
wow. So facts become filtered through a partisan lens.
It appears so. And another example is a study looking at the impact of Watergate. You'd think such a major scandal would cause people to reevaluate things based on the facts.
You would hope.
But the study found that people's prior attitudes towards Nixon and the parties heavily influenced how they perceive the issues surrounding Watergate. Even something that big was often interpreted through existing partisan commitments, especially among the most politically aware people.
Wait, so being more informed doesn't necessarily make you less biased?
That's the really counterintuitive finding. The book suggests that politically sophisticated voters, the ones who follow politics closely, might actually be more adept at using partisan cues to interpret information and less likely to evaluate things based on the neutral, objective criteria envisioned by the folk theory. They're better at fitting new information into their existing worldview.
That turns the folk theory completely on its head.
It really does challenge the core assumptions about informed citizens driving policy through elections.
Okay, so let's try to pull this all together. As we wrap up this deep dive into democracy for realists, it feels like the traditional story we tell ourselves about how democracy works.
Well, it's facing some serious challenges based on this evidence.
Absolutely. We've walked through the research suggesting, the limits of voters' detailed policy knowledge, the real difficulties in translating election results into clear mandates.
The potential downsides and unintended consequences of things like initiatives and referendums. Yeah, and the prevalence of this blind retrospection, where voters react to outcomes often unrelated to government performance.
And finally, the really powerful, maybe even primary, role of group identity and partisanship in driving vote choices, often overshadowing everything else.
It paints a very different picture from the folk theory.
It really does.
Yeah.
And it leaves us and leaves you listening with a pretty fundamental question to chew on, I think. If elections don't primarily function as this mechanism for informed citizens to carefully select policies, then what are the most important functions of elections in a democracy?
That's the big question, isn't it? Maybe it's less about detailed policy control and more about other things.
Like maybe their main value is ensuring a peaceful way to transfer power, or providing some level of accountability, even if it's imperfect and sometimes blind. Or maybe legitimizing the government in the eyes of the people.
Exactly. Thinking about elections through this more realistic, maybe slightly less romantic lens, it has real implications for how you understand the political world, how you engage with it, what you expect from it.
Definitely food for thought long after this deep dive is finished.
And look, if this discussion sparks your interest, we'd really encourage you to check out the book itself, Democracy for Realists.
Or even dig into the work of some of the key researchers we mentioned, Converse, Achen, Bartels, Delicarpini, Keeter. There's a lot more depth there if you want to keep exploring these, complex and honestly fascinating issues about how democracy really operates.